His clients being some of the wealthiest people in pretty much the entire United States, but definitely Chicago.
Adler was very elegant as a man and was interested in producing elegant architecture.
The majority of this house is designed for the people that were serving the Cudahys and their guests.
It almost made the list of demolished Adler houses.
Why he may not have been as famous, you almost have to go to the clientele. They are very secretive. They don't want the publicity.
Classical architecture and European architecture is sort of ingrained in our DNA, at least, 400 years of it. And I think that when I was a kid looking at architecture, looking at buildings, I would cut out the pages of magazines that had a beautiful classical piece in them, not knowing anything about architecture. It's something that I think we as Americans are always harkened back to, wanting to experience that earthy architecture that's connected to the ground by the materials that are used in the expression of the buildings.
In his late 20s, Adler left the rigorous Beaux-Arts Academy in Paris without having finalized his full degree and returned home to the Midwest in 1911 to work under the auspices of a premier Chicago architect, Howard Van Doren Shaw. He was especially known for his American craftsman homes for the wealthy and for co-designing Market Square in Lake Forest, Illinois. It's often called the first planned shopping center in America. Henry Dangler, his good friend from the École des Beaux-Arts, also worked in Shaw's firm. He introduced David to Catherine Keith, a lovely Chicago socialite, published author, and expert horsewoman, whom he married in 1916. David and Henry formed their own productive partnership not long after working for Shaw, when Henry earned his Illinois architecture license. In less than 5 years, they designed 16 prominent homes together. Many still stand. Tragically, Henry suddenly fell ill and died in 1917. He was only 35 years old. David abruptly lost his business partner and best friend. Not unlike the Daniel Burnham and John Root architecture partnership did, when Root suddenly died young. It was one of Chicago's most famous of the previous century. Burnham offered his impressive new urban plan for Chicago in 1909, keeping classical building styles from the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, of which he had managed the construction of. So in 1911, when Adler came back from studying classical architecture in France, it was perfect timing in Chicago for it. It has been said both time and place were ready for Adler. David could not legally sign his own plans solely, which he strictly oversaw, as he was not a licensed architect in Illinois. He obtained a New York license in 1917, but still needed someone to professionally sign his drawings in Illinois, where Henry Dangler had once done. A former co-worker in Shaw's office, Robert Work, would come to sign Adler's blueprints until 1929, when David was then eligible to take the licensing exam orally. With an esteemed portfolio of work of over 30 grand houses attesting to his abilities, he passed and signed his blueprints alone going forward.
Adler was very elegant as a man and was interested in producing elegant architecture. I think he was reserved and yet very much in tune with society and was in part of that society and social group. He was gentle. He had a natural way of meeting with people and talking with them and understanding their needs and their desires, and was able to provide that in the form of architecture.
His clients being some of the wealthiest people in pretty much the entire United States, but definitely Chicago. And a lot of these homes that he designed were used in the summers to entertain. And I can only imagine, some of the parties and business dealings and all of that would have happened during that time.
Innisfail II, the name of this estate, is an old name for Ireland. This was the second home David Adler designed for Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Cudahy. The first one was also a French style, but more formal. Joseph's father was one of the 4 Irish immigrant brothers who in 1887 founded the Armour Cudahy Meatpacking Company in Nebraska, with the backing of Danforth Armour. By the early 1920s, it was one of the nation's top food companies, with over $200 million in annual sales and 13,000 employees around the country. In 1957, it was listed in the very first S&P 500 stock market representation. The Cudahy Packing business was acquired by Bar S Foods in 1981. Jean Cudahy's grandfather, Sterling Morton, founded the very first Arbor Day in America in 1872, with over 1 million trees planted. He also served as Secretary of Agriculture under President Grover Cleveland. She continued with her family's devotion to nature and served on the board of the Morton Arboretum in Lisle, Illinois, which has 1,700 acres focused on the planting and conservation of trees and is open to the public. Her father founded the Arboretum and also established the Morton Salt Company. Both are still ongoing. Joseph Cudahy became president of the Cudahy Packing Company and Sinclair Oil. He was also a director of the Morton Salt Company. The Cudahys had other homes in Palm Beach and in Chicago.
This house was designed by David Adler in 1930. It's called Innisfail II. Innisfail I was the first house that David Adler designed for Joseph and Jean Cudahy. After Adler came back from France, and his wife had just passed away from a car accident, the Cudahys had asked Adler to design this house. Adler designed it as a French country manor house in Normandy. Designed it very much almost like a village. It has a number of buildings. It has a very nice stone wall up against Green Bay Road, much in the nature of the country farmhouses would have used stone walls to shelter their property from the road and also to keep the animals in.
On the original blueprint that David Adler drew, the entrance was here, and it has been subsequently moved.
During the era of Clement Stone, he bought this house in 1972, and he did many different modifications to the house. He put in central air conditioning instead of radiant heating and air conditioning, and he modified the entrance location from the south elevation of the house to the east elevation of the house. The reason he did that is that they wanted to expand this room, which is sort of the second largest room in the house. He wanted to create a solarium and have the south and east and west light enter into the house from this point. So he built this bustle to this elevation, used the same stone and the same detailing, but not the same architect because David Adler was no longer here. We moved to Lake Forest in 1987. And one of the first houses that we noticed was this house because of its 500-foot long wall that connected to and integrated with parts of the house, with the gateway entries as well to the courtyards. And I always wondered, boy, what's behind that wall? We could see pieces of the buildings, but you couldn't see the whole thing. And so it was very curious. But I said, I love that house. So 30 years later, we had an opportunity to buy this house. And the reason we had that opportunity was because it went into bankruptcy about 15 years earlier. And it became unoccupied and it began to deteriorate. And over the 15 years of its deterioration, it almost made the list of demolished Adler houses. The first thing we did was to rent the dumpsters and start to take out all of the overgrowth. So we spent a long time just basically taking stuff out and taking stuff away, bringing it back to, as much as possible, what was left over from the Adler period of time.
And there was almost a romanticism about this estate because of the grandeur of the wall and the stone and the mystique of what is behind that space. But to watch it deteriorate over that 30-year period was, it's one of those things that actually touches you, where you're saying, we got to fix this thing and someone's got to do something about it. And we took it on, not exactly knowing how much work we would have to do. 90% of the work that we did was in actually the cleanup process, refinishing surfaces, touching walls, things like that.
The shutters were black. The windows were covered with aluminum and glass storm windows. The antennas and wires were hanging over the roofing, and paint was peeling off all of the windows and woodwork. And the vines were actually crawling up onto the roof. It was just consuming the whole house. The swimming pool, you could hardly see the swimming pool. The swimming pool was like massive cattails growing out of the pond.
Why he may not have been as famous, I think you almost have to go to the clientele and look at how they are very secretive people in general themselves. And they don't want the publicity. This house, for instance, has not been highly publicized. The interior, to our knowledge, has never been shown to the public or publicized in any magazines or books.
The Grape Arbor, is that original?
The Grape Arbor is original, and you can see it behind the trees, how it overhangs the three windows to the reception space. And it provides a unique function of shading the windows. These buildings were not air conditioned at that time. In fact, the entire building had awnings on it, where all these windows had canvas awnings, red canvas awnings, as a matter of fact. The arbor was a very nice way of bringing the landscape up into the building and creating a very unique feature at the same time. I think that he faced the house primarily to the south for the entry, originally because he wanted to be able to drive in the south gate and through the wall and use the circular drop-off to what was relatively a simple, understated entrance to the house. Once you entered the house, there was an asymmetry that was going on. You entered into a center point of the house, but then you entered into a foyer which was asymmetrical to that entry. And it began to focus you to the fireplace and a small seating area in the foyer where you would come in, and the ceiling was actually lower in the foyer than in the major portion of the house. So as you walk through the foyer and you enter into this arched step-down walkway, the space begins to open up into a large gallery. And this gallery has windows to the east that overview what I think was a courtyard and a garden area. for the house, and probably a very formal garden area at that time. You walk through this gallery, and at the end of the gallery is another archway entry, and beyond that is a niche, which is also very much of an Adler niche, which carves out and domes back at the entry. So that became the focal point as you enter the gallery beyond, and then the stairway, which is the sort of asymmetrical formal stairway, goes upstairs to the second floor from there. I think he was a man that was very committed to his profession, and I think he was a person who had a wonderful sense of proportion, and he was humble in many respects in terms of how he brought you into the building, how he scaled the building down to the scale of human scale, and then he gradually increased and built up the house itself to the proportion that he would want to see many people occupy. So he was able to work with proportion, scale, and space in a very nice way.
Everything on the north side of the house is more set up for the servers of the estate. So caretaker's house, you have the maid's quarters, you have the kitchen facilities, you have the limousine area, chauffeur's area. All of that was on the north side of the house. So that the entrance point being on the south side has much more of a grandness to it. The entire south side of this house is designed with a little bit more detail than the north or even the east side of the house. And a lot of it is to take advantage of the backyard and the grandness of the estate from the rear. And we think that that's partially designed because of the era that it was designed in and the Great Depression, that they sort of have a humble front entrance point and a very grand backyard. So that when you come in, you see here and you have these parties, you look at that and you say, wow, this is fantastic.
But you go into that gallery and there are two doors that you enter into what would be called the living room in today's world. That room is a fairly large size room. It's about 18 by 43 and 10-foot high ceilings and 3 major windows, one of which was a double door entry to a terrace that was facing west. And the terrace itself was raised up about 4 feet from grade. So you come in off this stone terrace and you have this beautiful vista to the west.
We believe that the paneling at the original foyer, which is now more of a family room space, was original from England and brought over. And I think there's a great chance that several of the fireplaces were also imported.
I think in terms of many of the houses that Adler did, he was known for finding rooms in Europe and boxing them up and shipping it over in containers and using them later in his houses. And I think this house, that entryway that we just talked about of the intimate entryway with a fireplace was one such room. The library that's adjacent to it has very similar woodwork to it, but I believe that the library was actually drawn from scratch and built from scratch, but probably to relate to the entry. And I wonder, had he lived in a period that was 20 or 30 years longer, whether he would be influenced to do modern architecture. And some people that I know, like Robert Stern, started out as modernists in the 60s, and then they went into postmodernism and classical in the 70s and 80s, and have stayed in the vein of strictly classical, sort of a contemporary David Adler.
Adler chose who his clients were. And in this situation, this was the second house for that client. So he knew these clients very, very well. And if you look at the siting of this property and where the location of the gardens are, where the location of the greenhouse and the orangery is, it's 100% because he knew his audience when he was designing this for the Cudahys, who had a background with the Morton Arboretum and their family, and very strong situation with that. And really look at the house. The majority of this house is designed for the people that were serving the Cudahys and their guests. It's a fun house to walk through and understand kind of that lifestyle, that romantic side of that era.
The scale of spaces went from intimate at the entry to a more grand linear space to a sizable reception room and dining room next to it.
Large building that we have here, it seems very small when you're inside. So what's interesting about that is the way that it's designed to kind of move you into space to space. You don't actually feel that it's this huge grand space, unlike some other architects of that time that may have done very large rooms that are super grand and somewhat stuffy, in my opinion. This doesn't have any of that at all.
The use of the materials are neutral and friendly. The detailing of the house is not overdone. The cornices throughout one room are very different from the next, and it has even touches of Art Deco mixed in with country French and classical. It's eclectic in a certain sort of way once you get inside, but the outside is very consistent. Again, very simply detailed, and most of the detailing is for functional purposes. The way water comes off the roof and on the walls, and how the windows are set back to give it a strength and a weightiness to it. And the way in which the materials are detailed, especially in the openings, are very subtle, with just a very subtle arch to most of these windowsills and headers. And so it's just beautifully crafted as a house throughout. I think that classical architecture will always be around. It defines the word classic and timeless. Classical architecture has been around for many, many years, and what we see now is just a new version of neoclassicism, which was a new version of the original Greek and Roman architecture. So it keeps reinventing itself from one period of architecture to the next. He also was friends with modern architects. I heard a story about Adler. One day he was walking down the stairs of the Art Institute, and at the time when John Hollibird and another associate of his were walking up, and he saw David Adler, and they were all on the search committee for finding a dean for the School of Architecture at the Armor Institute. And they asked Adler about Mies, and what do you think about Ludwig Mies van der Rohe? Do you know him? And he said, yes, I do, and I would recommend him, and sure enough, they took that to heart and asked Mies to come, and he did, and formed IIT, and he was one of the truly transformational architects. In his early work, Mies would do buildings like Adler did in the 30s and 40s. I think that children should look at the Adler work to see what America was striving to get to in the post-World War I and post-Depression era. A lifestyle of grandeur and opulence in some sort of way. And America has always been about striving for something new and grand.